Think you know Ivan the Terrible? Maybe you picture a typical tyrant, cruel decrees, the occasional assassination, a palace dripping with gold. Now imagine a monarch who went further, who surrounded himself with decapitated enemies the way other kings displayed tapestries. Welcome to the life of Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible, a man whose paranoia turned murder into decor. He ruled as Russia's first official Tsar from 1547 to 1584. Travelers to Moscow recorded that in the private quarters of the Kremlin, he maintained what contemporaries called a gallery of heads. According to foreign ambassadors and Russian chroniclers, Ivan kept the freshly severed heads of executed nobles arranged on shelves or propped in large jars of brine. He reportedly invited select guests to dinner, while the macabre trophies stared back at them, their faces preserved like grotesque conversation pieces. This was no isolated rumor. Accounts from English envoy Jerome Horsey describe Ivan stroking the hair of a severed head while calmly discussing politics. German mercenaries spoke of a chamber where the Tsar would sit and consult the dead, muttering to them as if expecting advice. Whether every detail is literal or part folklore, the core truth is chilling. Ivan wanted everyone, friend or foe, to know that disobedience ended not just in death, but in permanent visible humiliation. To understand how a Russian ruler reached this point, you have to look at the childhood that forged him. He was only 3 when his father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died from an infected abscess. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, acted as regent, but was likely poisoned when Ivan was 8. What followed was nearly a decade of chaos. Boyar nobles fought for control, often ignoring or abusing the orphaned prince. Some historians describe the young Ivan watching these men beat servants to death for sport while he hid in palace corridors. He learned early that life at court was a game of cruelty, and cruelty became his language of power. When Ivan turned 16, he was crowned Tsar of All Russia, the first ruler to take that title. At first he surprised everyone. He reformed law codes, modernized the army, and married Anastasia Romanovna, a match that briefly steadied his violent temper. For a moment, it looked like Russia might enjoy a capable, even enlightened reign. But tragedy and suspicion soon warped that promise. Anastasia died suddenly in 1560, most likely of natural illness. But Ivan was convinced she had been poisoned by scheming boyars. Her death snapped the fragile restraint he had built since childhood. The young Tsar, who once issued progressive reforms, began to see enemies in every shadow. He grew erratic, disappearing for weeks on wild hunting trips or sudden pilgrimages, only to return with lists of courtiers he believed were traitors. And he devised a personal force to carry out his vengeance, the Oprichniki, a black-clad secret police whose emblem was a severed dog's head and a broom, symbols of sniffing out treachery and sweeping it away. They rode black horses and answered only to Ivan, spreading terror from Moscow to the distant provinces. This is where the infamous room of heads fits into his psychology. For Ivan, killing wasn't merely punishment, it was theater, a way to broadcast absolute power. Executions were often public spectacles. Victims were flayed, boiled, or impaled. Their remains paraded through Red Square. Bringing the severed heads back to his private chamber turned the message inward, a constant reminder to himself and his court that betrayal would be met with permanent disgrace. He reportedly gave some of the heads nicknames and spoke to them as if they were advisors who would never betray him. Foreign diplomats were horrified. A Jesuit envoy described banquets where Ivan would alternate between charming conversation and sudden fits of violence, ordering a servant beheaded mid-meal, then returning to his wine as if nothing had happened. English traders from the Muscovy Company wrote that the smell of decay clung to the Tsar's private hallways, the stench of salted flesh impossible to hide. Whether every guest truly saw the gallery of heads is impossible to prove, but enough independent reports exist to convince most historians that something like it was real, and the terror only escalated. In 1565, Ivan formally divided his realm into 2 parts. One, the Zemshchina, was ruled by traditional boyar councils. The other, the Oprichnina, was his personal domain, patrolled by the Oprichniki and subject to his absolute will. Entire towns were razed under suspicion of disloyalty. Merchants were tortured for imagined conspiracies. Priests were forced to bless mass executions. He would sometimes preside personally, watching as men were skinned alive or drowned in icy rivers. then retreat to his private chamber, where the latest heads were added to his morbid collection. By the late 1560s, Moscow lived in a climate of fear so intense that people whispered prayers before mentioning the Tsar's name. Children were warned that careless talk could bring the Oprichniki to their door. And still, Ivan wanted more control. He began conducting secret interrogations in his palace, dragging nobles into candlelit rooms where the severed heads of their former colleagues looked on. Witnesses said he believed the dead were helping him read the hearts of the living. This is the man behind the title. Terrible. Not simply a cruel autocrat, but a ruler who turned death itself into furniture, who used the corpses of enemies as silent counselors, who made fear the foundation of his government. And as his paranoia deepened, the violence would only become more spectacular. His private chamber of severed heads was only a symptom of a far larger sickness. The most infamous episode came in 1570 with the massacre of Novgorod. Ivan convinced himself that the wealthy trading city was plotting to defect to Lithuania. No evidence was ever produced, but suspicion was enough. He marched north with thousands of Oprichniki, surrounding Novgorod in the dead of winter. For 5 weeks, the city became a laboratory of cruelty. Entire families were chained together and hurled into the icy Volkhov River, while priests read blessings over the water. Merchants were roasted alive over open fires. Children were whipped until their bones showed and then left to freeze. Contemporary chronicles estimate 10 to 15,000 dead, though some modern historians believe the toll was even higher. He reportedly watched the drownings from a raised platform, wrapped in furs, calmly giving orders as the river filled with bodies. The terror did not end when the Tsar left Novgorod. Villages suspected of sympathy were burned to the ground on the march back to Moscow. Survivors were forced to carry heads of neighbors on pikes as a warning to others. Inside Moscow, the atmosphere was no less chilling. The Tsar began holding what can only be described as murder festivals. Witnesses describe banquets where noble families were invited to dine, only for the Oprichniki to burst in mid-meal and drag guests to their deaths. His own family was not spared. Ivan's temper, once merely threatening, grew volcanic. In 1581, he accused his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, of conspiring with foreign powers. The quarrel began when the younger Ivan defended his pregnant wife. After the Tsar struck her for wearing immodest clothing, rage blinded the ruler. He swung his heavy iron staff at his son's head, crushing the skull. The heir died within days. Ivan reportedly howled in grief, begging forgiveness from the son he had just killed. But the damage was done. With one blow, he had destroyed the succession and planted the seeds of Russia's future chaos. Meanwhile, the gallery of heads grew. Foreigners watched with morbid fascination. English merchants of the Muscovy Company sent letters home describing a capital thick with smoke of burning men. A Venetian ambassador called Moscow a place where the very air trembles with fear. Rumors of the head chamber circulated across Europe, fueling the legend of a ruler, half demon, half madman. Some doubted the stories until they visited the Kremlin and smelled the brine-soaked trophies for themselves. As Ivan aged, his body betrayed him. Years of stress, poor diet, and possible mercury treatments for chronic illnesses left him bloated and unstable. But the paranoia never eased. He demanded ever more elaborate precautions, food tasters for every meal, armed guards sleeping at the foot of his bed, and priests chanting through the night to ward off demons. By the early 1580s, the Tsar, who had once expanded Russia's borders, now ruled a shrinking, starving kingdom. Yet the fear he inspired remained absolute. Nobles bowed lower, servants spoke in whispers, and even foreign ambassadors addressed him as if speaking to a living storm. Inside the Kremlin, beneath flickering candlelight, the faces of the dead stared back at the living, a permanent reminder of what defiance cost. By the 1580s, Ivan IV was a shadow of the young ruler who had once modernized Russia. His body was swollen from years of stress and sickness, his beard streaked with silver, his mind as suspicious as ever. In March 1584, the end came quietly and strangely. Ivan invited a few trusted men to a late-night chess game, one of his few remaining pleasures. Witnesses say he was in an unusually jovial mood, joking about plans to take a new wife, his seventh. Then mid-match he slumped forward and collapsed. Some claimed he died instantly, others that he lingered for minutes, eyes rolled back, mouth foaming. The guards rushed in, but the most feared man in Russia was already gone. He was 53. Rumors ignited immediately. Some whispered of poison, others of a stroke brought on by rage and drink. Centuries later, scientists analyzing his remains found high levels of mercury and arsenic in his bones. For days, no one dared enter Ivan's private quarters. When they finally did, they found the Chamber of Heads. Many were still remarkably preserved in brine, their features twisted into final expressions of pain. His passing left Russia unsteady and directionless. His son Fyodor ascended the throne, but lacked the will to govern. Real power fell to Boris Godunov, a talented but mistrusted noble. The instability opened the door to years of famine, civil war, and foreign invasion, the period Russians still call the Time of Troubles. In many ways, Ivan's ghost haunted the nation more effectively than he had in life. He had shown how absolute power could be taken, and others were eager to follow the path he carved in blood. Inside Russia, the legend grew even stranger. Peasants told stories of Ivan wandering the countryside at night, cloaked in black, still hunting traitors. In Moscow, mothers warned children that if they misbehaved, the Tsar's ghost would come for them, carrying the heads of the disobedient in a sack. Even today, some visitors to the Kremlin say they feel an icy draft near the site of his private chamber, as if history itself refuses to rest. Modern historians see in Ivan's reign a cautionary tale. He began as a capable reformer who unified a vast and fractious land. But fear consumed him. He let childhood trauma harden into paranoia, and paranoia into sadism. He used violence not only to punish enemies, but to shape the psychology of an entire nation. His gallery of heads was more than a gruesome hobby. It was a political statement, proof that loyalty meant survival, and that the Tsar's wrath extended beyond death. And that is perhaps the most unsettling lesson. He did achieve a kind of immortality, though not the kind he sought. His dynasty faltered, his empire nearly collapsed, but his name endures as a synonym for terror. More than 4 centuries later, Russian culture still wrestles with his shadow, from operas and novels to debates about strong leadership. The man who spoke to severed heads continues to speak through history, warning and tempting future rulers. Picture the scene one last time. A candlelit chamber in the Kremlin, the stone walls cold and damp, shelves lined with jars, each containing the face of a man who once plotted or merely appeared to plot against the throne. A lone figure in heavy robes enters, his footsteps echoing. He sits among the dead, whispering questions only he can hear, seeking counsel from the silent witnesses of his own cruelty. That image, half fact, half nightmare, is why Ivan IV is remembered not just as a brutal Tsar, but as the ruler who turned death itself into his court.